Free collective bargaining and freedom itself face a serious and direct challenge. At this moment, Congress is considering several bills which would deny workers the right to strike and force them to work under conditions dictated by the government.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
COPE report for April 1972. 7 months to election. This month on side 1, the right to strike. It's under the gun. And George Wallace, Democrat or demagogue, populist or pitchman.
Which side are you on?
The Nixon administration has proposed that workers in the transportation industry be denied the right to strike. AFL-CIO Legislative Director Andrew J. B. Miller told COPE report that backers of compulsory arbitration won't stop with their immediate objective, transportation workers.
The general target is the right of free men to join together and take economic action to improve the conditions under which they work. Sponsors of these bills don't intend to stop with transportation workers. Some of them propose a study of compulsory arbitration in other industries. Stripped of its public relations title, the Crippling Strikes Prevention Act, the administration proposal is little more than an untested, unproven, and untried form of compulsory arbitration, backed with the government clout of a denial of the right to strike. Once this nation starts down the path of compulsion as a way of life, it will not stop with workers. The history of every dictatorship proves that once a government is allowed to compel workers to labor against their will, it inevitably uses the weapon of compulsion against employers and ultimately against all citizens.
Mr. B. Miller, what would this legislation do?
Basically, the compulsory arbitration proposal would undercut collective bargaining and substitute for it a system of forced settlement with the fancy name of final offer selection. Strikes would be outlawed. An arbitration panel appointed by the President or the Secretary of Labor would be required to choose between the final offers made by management and the union. Nothing could be changed about the offer that is selected. Either the whole proposal is accepted or it is rejected. The selected offer would, in effect, become the contract between the company and the union. As such, it would have the force of law. By banning strikes, this proposal would destroy the effectiveness of collective bargaining. One party to a dispute or the other will realize that compulsory arbitration will work to its advantage. The built-in incentive, therefore, is not to bargain at all. Thus, a take-it-or-leave-it approach, rather than the collective bargaining, would be rewarded.
What is the AFL-CIO position?
The AFL-CIO is opposed to any form of compulsory arbitration, which would force an employee to work for the profit of his employer on terms dictated by the government. On the other hand, organized labor wholeheartedly supports the concept of voluntary arbitration, where the parties jointly agree to accept an umpire's decision as final and binding. The difference between the words voluntary and compulsory is the difference between freedom and its denial. While the compulsory arbitration measures currently pending in the Congress are limited to transportation, there is little doubt that these restrictions on workers' rights, if they are enacted, would be extended to other industries.
What can workers do to prevent a loss of the right to strike?
All union members are threatened by the compulsory arbitration legislation now being considered by the Congress. Union members don't like strikes. No one does. But free workers, if they are to be free, must have the right to strike. Write your congressmen and senators today. Tell them that under the terms of any of the compulsory arbitration legislation now being considered in Congress, that free collective bargaining will end. For all an employer has to do is say no, and the government will set the terms of your contract and prohibit you from striking. Tell your representatives that freedom is on the line. Tell them that if America is to be free, then the workers must be free. American workers must never surrender their rights as free men. Compulsory arbitration in any form is a denial of the rights of free men. Protect your freedom, write immediately.
George Wallace, candidate for president, is making a strong appeal as the workers' friend. But who are Wallace's real friends? COPE Report asks Wes McCune, Director of Group Research, an independent private organization that studies the extremist movements in America.
George Wallace couldn't be a genuine populist and have the ardent support of the John Birch Society and other radical right groups. There's just no way he could have it both ways. The main support for him 4 years ago, and continuing support, is the very reactionary, extremist fringe of the radical right in this country. A few years ago, he had also garden variety conservative support, but that's sort of going over towards John Ashbrook direction, or anti-Nixon for the moment.
Mr. McCune talked about Wallace's water carriers of the right.
In the 50 states where he got on ballot by dint of much hard work, the people who got him on, the ringleaders, were taken from two groups, the John Birch Society and the White Citizens Councils. And this was not just in the South. This went into many northern states as well. These were the people who carried the water and chopped the wood for him. They were behind the scenes for the most part, and the story of this never got the publicity it should have had.
Wallace and the leaders of the right wing. What is their relationship, Mr. McCune?
Well, beginning at the top, the man who founded the John Birch Society and is still its head, Robert Welch, is remembered best as the man who called General Dwight D. Eisenhower a dedicated, conscious tool of the communist conspiracy. He's sought many times to disassociate himself from that remark, but has been unable to. It is John Birch Society philosophy. That is the kind of screwball thinking that George Wallace doesn't seem to mind at all. He goes to the Welch dinner, and also to please the crowds at one of their annual 4th of July rallies. He writes a major article for the John Birch magazine and has welcomed Birch support in many states. For example, he went so far one year as to declare a certain date John Birch Day in Alabama. I think that illustrates very close cooperation.
Mr. McCune revealed that the link between Wallace and the right wing has lasted a long time.
Wallace started associating with the organized right wing long before people in the country in general heard of him. He has gone to a number of meetings of the White Citizens Councils, particularly their national dinners at Jackson, Mississippi, and has been a featured speaker always, extremely popular with the White Citizens Councils. And many of their leaders have in turn helped get him on the ballot and done campaign work for him. The White Citizens Council is closely linked with the John Birch Society through its editor and through some of its other speakers and staff. One of his speechwriters was even a Klansman, and he has had some Klansmen around him, not just the segregationists, but also some Negro haters and some Jew baiters have helped Wallace, particularly in California and in some other states. And this was going on for some time before he decided to run for president.
If Wallace were a genuine populist, would the right wing touch him? Not with a 10-foot pole, says Mr. McCune.
It seems very clear on the record of the organized right wing that Wallace has not presented them any of his so-called populism. They wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole if he were a populist or a liberal. They live and organize and feed their own organization on hatred and reaction, and they would not embrace a man of this sort if he were any kind of a liberal. He just can't possibly have it both ways, and I think that the voters are going to discover that his heart really belongs to the right wing and always has.
Wallace, his friends, and the labor movement. Mr. McCune.
Some of Wallace's good friends and supporters have been very actively anti-labor, such as Southern States Industrial Councils. Another example is H.L. Hunt's Lifelines on the air every day, and many other programs. Dr. George Benson's radio programs constantly pick away at labor and present the theme that inflation's caused by wages, etc.
A reminder and a word of caution, Mr. McCune.
The impact of the right wing on George Wallace and vice versa, I think, is clearly illustrated by the fact that when he became governor of Alabama, there was a right-to-work law on the statutes there, and that since then, through administrations of his friends and his own wife and himself again, there has been no serious attempt to remove that law, that anti-union law, from the books of Alabama. Anyone listening to Wallace's campaign ought to remember a hard fact like that and examine all of these right-wing groups who are working with him before he listens to any glib campaign talk about being a friend of the working man.
Cope Report asked Mr. McCune if he thought the right-to-work drive nationally was on its deathbed.
No. In Congress, there are a number of leaders who are trying to pass right-to-work laws, as you know, and organizations working in the state legislatures as well. It's far from dead. The National Right to Work Committee has never been dead. It is more active on the Hill now in Congress.
Then there is a spin-off group of the Right to Work Committee. What about the Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation, Mr. McCune?
A legal defense foundation has two advantages. One, it uses computerized fund appeals through direct mail. And two, it has obtained tax exemption from the Internal Revenue Service so that people who contribute can deduct it from their income tax. This move of theirs is buttressed by a number of other conservative groups and right-wing groups. For example, Liberty Lobby, which is somewhat to the right of the John Birch Society on many scores, has started raising money for congressional candidates of the extreme conservative stripe. And the campaign is being run by a man named David Malthrop, who has crisscrossed this country many times in years past, arguing for right-to-work laws. And they have another person over there named Leif Hooser at the Liberty Lobby, who used to be in charge of organizing for the National Right to Work Committee. So that, plus the general buttressing of all the conservative groups who don't like organized labor, adds up to a pretty rough time, in my opinion, for quite a while to come.
To sum up, George Wallace is a pitchman, not a populist, a demagogue, not a Democrat. And his record is clear. George Wallace is no friend of workers or their unions.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Cope Report continues on side 2 of this cassette with up-to-the-minute information on the decision of labor to walk off the pay board.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
On November 18th, we reported to the AFL-CIO convention, and I quote, "There is little hope that economic justice can be achieved by this board, the majority of whom are guided by the dictates of the administration or the interests of big business. We have reviewed the events of the past 4 months. We have carefully examined the record. It is our duty now to report to the membership of the trade union movement and the American public that we have no hope for fairness, equity, or justice in the pay board."
When the union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run, there can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. For no force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one, but the union makes us strong.
Cope Report for April 1972. 7 months to election. This month, the AFL-CIO Executive Council reports on the unfairness of the Nixon pay board.
For the union makes us strong.
At a crowded Washington press conference, President Meany explained the fallacy of the Nixon administration's economic policies.
7 months of the administration's so-called new economic policy, including 4 months of Phase 2 controls, have demonstrated that it is nothing more than a device to make the average worker and consumer both the victim and the goat, while the banks and big business pile up increasing profit. In the guise of an anti-inflation policy, the American people are being gouged at the supermarket and squeezed in the paycheck. The heaviest burden of this lopsided program is placed on the backs of those at the bottom of the economic ladder who are least able to protect themselves. Meanwhile, millions of American workers remain unemployed, their wages frozen at zero with no prospect of relief.
While wages are held down, prices are soaring.
The continuing rapid rise of prices, such as February's 8.4 yearly rate of increase in wholesale prices, reveals the emptiness of the price control program. Retail prices have gone through the roof and are continuing up, eroding the buying power of American families. While the administration permits this rising tide of price increases, its pay board persists in holding down workers' wages. Yet profits are free to rise without even the pretense of controls. Instead of a tax on excess profits in a period of wage controls, the administration has provided business with additional billions of dollars of tax bonanzas, reducing federal revenues and further inflating the deficit at the expense of the nation's most pressing needs.
The job of the Price Commission is to make sure business gets its profits, but the job of the pay board is to get workers.
The pay board is an integral part of the administration's effort to place the burden of its failures on the backs of workers while providing favors and financial gains to those who already have too much. The board is not tripartite. It is not independent and autonomous. The pay board represents government control. It represents political and business interests.
The business and so-called public members of the pay board represent the Nixon administration, making the pay board government-controlled.
If the wage stabilization program is to be government-controlled, let it be so openly and clearly. Let the people who are exercising the power take the full responsibility for their decisions, without the facade of labor representation and the pretense of tripartitism. The AFL-CIO members, therefore, are immediately resigning from the pay board. We will not be part of the window dressing for this system of inequitable government control of wages for the benefit of business profit.
Mr. Meany summarized the Executive Council's position.
It is now very clear that the administration's new economic policy is nothing more nor less than a means of shifting to the average working man and his family the burden and blame for the dismal failure of its former economic policy. It is an effort at the expense of personal and institutional freedom in this country to avoid the measures resisted by big business and other selfish interests, such as constructive tax reform, most needed to correct the consequences of that failure. Having, as we do, a deep disbelief in and distrust of the aims and purposes of this administration's economic and social policies, we intend at the least to free representatives of the AFL-CIO from any grounds for the inference of complicity in the formulation or execution of those policies.
A reporter asked,
Isn't there a danger now, Mr. Meany, that the White House can point to you, the AFL-CIO, and say, you are the people who sabotaged?
I'm quite sure that's what they're going to say. This is par for the course as far as they're concerned. They look for a scapegoat. But I wonder why it is that the press seems to ignore the fact that we had 2.5 years of a Nixon economic policy from February 1969 to August of 1971, and that no one has ever explained the failure of that policy, and no one has ever explained why they went to another policy. And I'd like to point out that beginning back in 1966, the AFL-CIO said time and again that we would accept controls in order to fight inflation on a voluntary basis, provided that those controls ran to all forms of income and that they were fair and equitable. The only thing that's really controlled here is wages. And as far as prices are concerned, if you think the prices are not going up, ask your wives.
President Meany also testified at a hearing held by the Price Commission. He rejected the administration's charges that labor was sabotaging Phase 2.
We participated in Phase 2 in good faith, desiring, despite our misgivings, to try and make it work. We tried. We didn't fail Phase 2, but we're completely convinced that Phase 2 has failed America.
Phase 2 failed the poor.
The labor members of the pay board met with solid opposition from the business and so-called public members when we sought to fulfill the intent of Congress and exempt from control the wages of the lowest paid workers. At the same time, the Cost of Living Council was exempting all used articles from price controls. And of course, it's the poor who buy used goods.
Phase 2 also failed consumers.
The AFL-CIO established a price monitoring program to help this commission check price increases. Instead of encouragement, we received from the chairman the statement that consumers had no way of telling if price increases were legitimate from the administration's consumer advisor the charge that we were trying to sabotage price controls by reporting suspected violations, and from the Internal Revenue Service, just nothing. No reply whatever concerning the suspected violations we reported.
It failed low-wage workers.
While the pay board was insisting over the objections of the labor members that wage increases for workers even in the smallest establishments must have specific approval if they exceeded the 5.5% guideline, the Cost of Living Council completely exempted the prices their employers charge.
And this is the result.
There is little doubt that Phase 2 is loaded against workers and consumers. 100% of a worker's paycheck is controlled. Wages are controlled by patriotic American employers who go along with the president, go along with the decisions of the pay board, and find it quite pleasant, I believe, to go along. 100% of the worker's paycheck is controlled, but 21% of the consumer price index, what a worker's paycheck must buy, is not controlled.
One thing is perfectly clear about the Nixon administration's economic policies. Cows have preference over workers and consumers.
Boys, I don't mind telling you, if Dick Nixon is a-setting around the White House a-depending on me to re-elect him president next November, he might as well drop out of that race today. He's done hurt my feelings. You see, last summer, when I was working on a construction job, I was drawing $2 an hour. Still am. Down at the supermarket, I noticed a certain cut of prime beef was a-selling. Same amount, $2 a pound. Well, here comes Dick Nixon with his price and wage controls and run that deep freeze on to us. Frizz my wages and that beef at the same amount, $2 a pound. Now, 8 months later, my wages still froze $2. I go down to the supermarket and I notice that same cut of beef has gone up to $2.50. Tell you, far as I'm concerned, that proves something I've knowed all along. Dick Nixon thinks more of a cut of beef than he does of me, 25% more, which makes me think about 100% less of Dick Nixon.
Solidarity forever.
This has been Cope Report for April 1972. Next month, more up-to-the-minute reports on politics, the economy, legislation, issues of vital concern to trade union members and their families.
Solidarity forever.